Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about key issues with Genesis. And this presentation was done at The Ohio State University, but obviously it was recorded a ways back, and we are just catching up with some of our meetings, putting them online. And so I'm not going to talk about every single issue with Genesis. I'm just going to talk about some of the key issues that come up in our discussions with other people. I know in many cases, some people may have never talked to others about this. Some people have never encountered some of these topics. So this may be new for some people, may be old news for others. So when it comes to Genesis, of course, there's been a slew of books written on Genesis. It's one of the most debated books of the Bible, especially Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 1 to 3. And so John Walton's book here was always has always been a book that people have discussed and debated. It's still being debated and discussed, but that's a very, very, very well-known book on Genesis, been written within the last 10 years. Zondervan put out another book here in the middle called Genesis, History, Fiction, or Neither One. Neither one. That was a book on different views of Genesis, whether it's really telling actual history or whether it's some sort of mythology. But anyway, you can read that one. And then reading Genesis 1 to 2, and Evangelical Conversation is another book that's come out that helps with this topic. And then you have Hugh Ross's book up on the top there from the ministry Reasons to Believe, called Navigating Genesis. Of course, Hugh Ross is an old earth creationist. Then you have John Collins' book, Reading Genesis Well. And John Collins has a background in both biblical studies and science. You can read his books on science. He's got some really good books on science. But anyway, he tackles Genesis there. And then the middle book, Origins, this has come out over the last year or so by Paul Copon and Douglas Jacoby. And then you have Mapping the Origins Debate that came out over the last 10 years. It's giving you all the different creation models in that book and all the different things that come up with those different models. So that's an excellent resource as well, put out by IVB Press. So I also want to mention that this is an excellent resource, a Dictionary of Christianity and Science. In this book, there are a series of articles or essays on different views, on different topics, on science and theology and the relationship between the two. But there are a ton of articles there in that book about Genesis, different views, old earth creationists, young earth creationists, different views of the flood, different views of cosmology, different views of Adam and Eve and evolution, all kinds of issues. So you're welcome to get that book. That is an excellent resource. Now, there's no doubt that worldview questions come up when we're talking about Genesis. Genesis plays a huge role in asking these major worldview questions, such as, is there a God? And if so, does God care about what's going on in the world? Where did everything come from? Is there meaning in the universe? Who are we as humans? Where did evil come from? What is the matter with people? Why can't we fix all our problems? What's wrong with the human race? And is there any hope for humanity at all? And so without Genesis, it's hard to know about some of these issues. Of course, natural revelation tells us things about God. We can know some things about the created world without the Bible, but the point is Genesis certainly addresses a lot of these questions. Now, when someone asks me if I'm a creationist, I've talked about this before. If it does come up, I, of course, respond with a question, as I always do. I always ask questions back instead of giving an answer sometimes. I ask for clarification. I say, do you mean rather than being a creationist, am I a naturalist or am I a materialist? In other words, do I believe the natural world is all there is, or do I believe the material world is all there is? Of course, the answer to that is no. Now, if people want to know if I believe this, instead of being a creationist versus believing in a creator who brought the universe into existence, and if this is my option out there, the answer would be no. This quote right here talks about man being alone in the universe and chance is the source of every innovation of all creation. So if someone's asking me if I believe that nature and chance alone made mankind without any mind behind it, without any thought behind it, a purely undirected process is how we got here, the answer is no. And if that means I'm a creationist, to the extent I believe there is a mind behind the creation, or a mind behind the universe, a mind behind the laws of nature, the answer is yes. So I do not believe mankind is an accident of nature. Now, someone may say, well, that's not how I'm putting it. I don't think we're an accident. Well, if you don't believe in God or any kind of mind or intelligence behind the universe, it'd have to be purposeless. It has no direction. It has no, there's no mind behind it at all. It's completely undirected. And so technically you would be an accident of nature because doesn't have any purpose to it. It is accidental. It just so happened by chance that we're here. So it's important that we clarify what we mean when someone says, are you a creationist? Of course, this middle chart here gives us the different options, and probably of course, the column here with theism is the most compatible with what I believe. And so obviously pantheism is another option on the far right. Some people are pantheists, but you just have to clarify and ask questions what people mean when they bring up, are you a creationist? Some people obviously might flat out and say, I am a materialist. I believe the material world is all there is. Or they may say they believe God is one with creation. They're a pantheist. It just depends. So when someone brings up, are you creationist? Of course, some people think of Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham. That is the ministry that's devoted to young earth creationism. And some of the things they believe in, of course, they're all explained on their website. They have hundreds of articles laid out systematically about what they believe. So they defend all these views there. If you want to go deeper, just go to their website. But they believe the Genesis creation days must be 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, meaning that God created all things within 144 hours. Of course, the Genesis genealogies contain few, if any, gaps. The creation week occurred between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Neanderthals or Homo sapiens are the human descendants of Adam and Eve. The flood of Noah's time, Genesis 6-9, was a global event that submerged all the continents, destroyed all the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals, except those that were aboard the ark. Of course, the flood lasted about a year, which accounts virtually for all the Earth's geological features, fossils, and biodeposits. And all land animals alive today naturally descended from pairs of creatures on Noah's ship. Now, there's other creation views out there other than young earth creationism. There's old earth creationism, there's progressive creationism, there's gap theory, there's day age creationism, and even people that are theistic evolutionists or what we call evolutionary creationists believe God is the creator. He's using evolution as a mechanism. So they're not the same as atheistic evolution. They do believe in a creator. And then you have intelligent design, which does not really deal with Genesis at all. They're strictly dealing with the science and the philosophy of naturalism, and they think that undirected natural processes cannot account for the complexity of life. And so there are different positions out there. When someone says, ask if you're a creation, just remember there's different models that we can talk about. But the point is, all of these views believe, especially not flat earthers, I'm not talking about them. That's another topic. But the point is that many of these views all believe in a creator. It's just a matter of how he did it is different, the time frame and the mechanism involved. Old earth creationists, of course, have their apologists. Hugh Ross, with Reasons to Believe, has several resources out. You have David Snokes' book called A Biblical Case for Old Earth Creationism. He's another one that's an old earth creationist. And then this book right here called Creation, Evolution, Intelligent Design laid out really the views of young earth creationism, old earth creationism. You had Ken Ham, you had Hugh Ross, and you have Stephen Meyer for intelligent design, and then Deborah Marsarma from representing an evolutionary creationist view. But they all lay out their positions very clearly. They are critiqued by each other. So if you really want to know what they believe, you can get that book where they're laid out systematically and responded to. And then if you want to get into the age of the earth, if that's something that's very important to you, for some people it's the biggest thing ever, the most important thing ever. For other people it's not. But this book called Controversy of the Ages is a good book that deals with that. Controversy of the Ages, why Christians should not divide over the age of the earth. Now, something else that comes up is someone asks me if I believe in evolution. Of course, I always ask them what they mean by evolution because there's different definitions of evolution, as I say here. Number 1 and 2 are certainly not disputable. Everybody believes that. Number 3 and 4 are disputable because Obviously, to say that natural selection or anti-mutation can account for the complexity of life without any guidance is challenged, can be challenged, and of course, universal common descent is challenged as well. And then one of the most common definitions, or one thing that is behind naturalistic evolution, is the blind watchmaker thesis that all organisms have descended from common ancestors through unguided or unintelligent, purposeless material processes. And those processes, such as natural selection, act on random variations and mutations in the mechanisms of natural selection, random mutation and variation, and perhaps other similarity. Naturalistic mechanisms are completely sufficient to account for the appearance of designed living organisms. Of course, that is incompatible with biblical faith, and of course, incompatible with intelligent design, and incompatible with any creation model. So that is something that I certainly would reject if someone defines evolution in that way. Some of the problems with chemical and biological evolution are pointed out in this book. There's a chapter on it by Casey Luskin. It's talked about it towards the end of the book. Number one, there's no viable mechanism to generate a primordial soup. Unguided chemical processes cannot account for the origin of the genetic code. Random mutations cannot generate the genetic information required for irreducibly complex structures. Natural selection struggles to fix advantageous traits into populations. Abrupt appearance of species in the fossil records does not support Darwinian evolution, and modern biology has failed to yield a grand tree of life. Convergent evolution challenges Darwinianism, destroys the logic behind common ancestry, and differences between vertebrate embryos contradict the predictions of common ancestry. Neo-Darwinism struggles to explain the biogeographical distributions of many species. Neo-Darwinism has a long history of inaccurate predictions about organs and junk DNA. And then humans display many behaviors and cognitive abilities that offer no apparent survival advantage. And so these things are talked about in that book. There's a chapter on it. But these issues are debated. It's just important to understand when someone says evolution is true, it's a settled fact, and God doesn't exist, it's one of the most simplistic statements ever made. And unfortunately, it's so unjustifiable, and to say that it's just simply settled like fact is just ridiculous. So these things are debated. There's ongoing debates that are going on right now. They've always been debated. So let's just make sure we're defining our terms and what we mean, and make sure we're talking about these issues. Then you have people, as I said, that punt to what's called theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, and that's been responded to in these books right here. There's more than enough resources out there to talk about it. So you can read these. The theistic evolution one in the middle there, the white book, is one of the largest treatments of the topic. And you just need to understand that these issues are being debated. And so make sure you do your homework. I think it's important to remember these tactics do not get caught up in the age of the earth. That's not the primary issue. The main issue is whether there's a God who created. Most of the times I talk to people, we're mostly debating whether there's a God, and so the age of the earth doesn't come up that much. It seems like the age of the earth is more debated among Christians, Christians that want to debate the topic continuously. Then, of course, as I said, you always need to define your terms, and we need to ask someone what they mean by creation or evolution. And then finally, of course, the first issue is, what is the gospel? We need to ask people, what they believe about the gospel is the first question. We can deal with the creation evolution later. Of course, Genesis does impact the gospel, but we need to understand that we need to be asking them the first question, what they believe, of course, about the good news and who Jesus is. Remember the purpose of Genesis 1 to 11. Let's not forget Genesis chapters 12 to 50. Some people forget that there are other things in Genesis other than debating Genesis 1 to 11. Let's remember the formation of Israel in chapter 12 and the rest of Genesis. So when we talk about the purpose of Genesis 1 to 11, we need to remember that, of course, there is only one God. We need to remember that this God comprehensively controls the world, rules and controls the world. He has no competition or interference from other gods. In the ancient Near East, of course, polytheism abounded, But we need to remember that the book of Genesis teaches that there is Israel's God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he is not a tribal God. He is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and Israel's God intends to bless all the families of the earth through Israel. And of course, Genesis 1 is about God. We know that he's the main character there, the key player. And we know that it says here that in many verses it says, in the beginning God, and in the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. It says, and God said, and God, and God, and God in many passages. So God is mentioned 32 times in this chapter. And we know that it said, God saw, God separated, God called, God made, God set, God created. So the point is, God is the big hero of chapter 1. We also know with the God of the Bible and polytheism that the biblical God implies unity, order, and harmony in the world he has made. We know in polytheism the gods interact with each other in a semi-chaotic manner and to threaten to make chaos a permanent aspect of practical experience. And we know that polytheism offers no stable or permanent laws that science can explore, and by contrast, biblical monotheism offers a foundation for the dependability and constancy of law, and that is why many of the scientists in the medieval period found a basis for science in theism or the God of the Bible, because the first scientists believed the universe was uniform, rational, and intelligible. This is talked about in the book God's Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid the Foundations of the Modern World by James Hannam, and he talks about that. And so we understand a lot of the first Christians or the first scientists or the people that helped start science in the medieval period were deists or theists. They believed in a creator. They believed that the laws of nature were orderly, and they believed the universe allowed for science, and that was because of a personal God, or at least a God that was that allowed order, rationality, and intelligibility. Even Paul Davies here, who is not even a secular or not even a Christian, he's actually mostly agnostic or somewhat deistic, but he teaches physics. Has a lot of books on Amazon, by the way. So he says in his book Physics in the Mind of God, he says even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd and that there is a rational basis to physical existence manifested as a law like order in nature. This is at least in part comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Genesis 1-2, of course, is not the only creation account in the Bible. We can find descriptions of God's creation of the cosmos and humans also in other parts of the Bible, as I list here. Now, people say, well, why did God create? Some people ask it every once in a while. One thing we don't want to say is that God was lonely. Biblically speaking, God is a triune being. He's in perfect fellowship, Father, Son, and Spirit. He did not decide to create man because he wanted fellowship with man or he was lonely. That's what some people say, and it's absolutely ridiculous. We know the creation is a free act of God. God is a triune being. We know that biblically speaking that the heavens declare the glory of God, as it says in Psalms 19:1. And we know that people need knowledge of God. They need to know what God is like. And unless God does something to communicate to us, we cannot know what he's like. He has to give knowledge of who he is. And he does that through the created order. So people should be able to look at the created world, as Paul talks about in Romans 1, and make inferences and cause and effect relationships and know that there is a God. They should be able to know that there is a God that is responsible for many features of reality in the natural world. How did God create? Well, we read biblically, of course, God created by his word of his power. He spoke and it came into being. We know that it said, God said, let us make man in our image. And that, of course, means that we have to believe in some kind of verbal revelation. Of course, nonverbal revelation is all, but verbal revelation is what God speaks to mankind or be a part of mankind in human language. We also know in the book 7 Days That Divide the World by John Lennox, um, it says here, of course, John Lennox says about this issue of God speaking, he says, of course, God, who is spirit, doesn't have a physical voice box, but he can communicate. And in other words, the expression in God said denotes real, literal communication, but we do not have the slightest idea as to how God does this. And that's true. We don't know how God, when you talk about God speaking, we don't know necessarily how to make sense of this. And that's absolutely right. And so I think that we want to try to not to think too hard about this because God's not a human being where he has like a voice box. We don't know how it works. So that makes good sense in what Lennox is saying there. Now, does Genesis make claims that correspond with reality? And the answer is yes, because we know that in Genesis it talks about how God created man in his image, and of course that has laid the groundwork for human rights and value and dignity throughout history. The humans all have dignity and value because God's blueprint is on them. It's not something that we give to each other. It's universal. It's not based on our ethnicity, not based on what we can do or can't do. The value and dignity of humans is already there because God has bestowed that on us, and that is laid out in human rights, of course, throughout country to country. We'll talk a little bit about cosmology at the beginning, whether cosmology talks about or can show that God created the universe. And of course, the fall of man shows there's something terribly wrong with man, that we see the degeneration of mankind. It seems that everything, including all life, is subject to decay. We see that with humans. There's something very wrong with humans. We know they can do some amazing things, but there seems to be something in them that allows them to do some incredibly horrible things as well. Sometimes we blame it on sociology or psychology or something else, but at the core, there's something very wrong with humans. And so the fall of man speaks to that issue. And then the Cambridge explosion, of course, supports a flood. You have to see Stephen Meyer's book called Darwin's Doubt. You can get that on Amazon, but the fossil record seems to show that there had to be some sort of flood, at least the way the fossil record lays out. So you can get his book there. I'm not going to explain it all right now, but you can look into it if you want. And then we have the documentary is Genesis History. You could check that out. That was done by Del Tackett. That's part of the Truth Project. That can be rented on Amazon. Now, we talk about the genre of Genesis. We're talking about what kind of literature it is. For a genre, of course, that refers to a category of texts that are closely related in form, content, tone, or some combination of elements. For example, we ask like what the book of Revelation is, what kind of genre is it? It's apocalyptic literature. Or what is it? What are the Psalms? Those are poetry. So we always want to ask when we're reading the Bible, when we're reading a certain book, what kind of literature is it we're reading? Because obviously there's several books in the Bible, 66 books. And not all of them are the same genre. And then we have the issue of whether Genesis is myth. Some people bring this up. They say, well, Genesis is myth. Once again, I respond by asking them, how are you defining myth? Do you mean a non-scientific account of how the world came to be? Do you mean myth is defined as the actions of superhuman beings, either gods or superhuman heroes? Or perhaps you mean that myth is fiction, like the opposite of history, something made up or even fantasy. Or is myth a type of literature that could be written in poetic form and may employ highly symbolic language, and yet myth can be considered writing about real events? And then we have the issue of materialism and naturalism. You know, some people, of course, the materialists or naturalists believe Genesis is fiction, meaning that it seems like it's no different than Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings because it's just totally fiction to them. Of course, that's what materialists or naturalists may say. And when again we get in the issue of what do we mean by literal? Of course, when Jesus speaks of feeding the 5,000, for someone that has a bias against miracles, they're obviously not going to think those things literally happen. And when Christians say that Jesus died and rose from the dead, we obviously believe Jesus really died a factual, actual death. We don't believe the resurrection is just an allegorical statement. We believe it's a physical event that really happened. There's no doubt that there's all kinds of metaphors in the Bible and figures of speech. Not everything's obviously literal in the extent, like if I say the car was flying down the road, the car and the road are very literal, but flying is a metaphor. We know the metaphor flying stands for something very real that could be expressed more literally as driving fast. For example, we know that Jesus uses all kinds of metaphors in his ministry. He says, I am the door, I am the bread of life. Those point to very literal experience of salvation, eternal life. But of course, Jesus is not a literal door, literal piece of bread. So what we need to remember whenever reading the Bible, the passages must be interpreted historically, grammatically, and contextually. And interpreting a passage historically means we must seek to understand the culture, background, situation that prompted the text. That's what we do with anything we read literature. We want to know what kind of literature it is. We want to interpret historically, grammatically, and contextually. And of course, the Bible has a ton of anthropomorphic language. That means that it describes God sometimes as speaking, creating, seeing, separating. Sometimes some passages says his outstretched arm and other things. So some of these things obviously are just anthropomorphic language to describe God. It doesn't mean that God's a non-factual being. It just means when it says God's outstretched arm or something, God does not have a literal arm. This is anthropomorphic language. So we need to understand that because there's a lot of that in Genesis. Then sometimes we ask, what do you mean by historical? We need to remember that Genesis 1-11 is historical in the sense are we asking, do these events really happen? And perhaps the description of those events is symbolic since the author uses rhetorical literary techniques. That we get in these issues and we ask whether it's historical or not. We know that Genesis 1-11 can be an historical narrative, which of course takes in the account of such things as metaphors and figures of speech. We know that people ask these questions about Genesis, such as, are there two literal Adam or historical, or are there two literal or historical people who walked this earth, such as Adam and Eve? Was there really an ark? Was there a worldwide flood? Did God create the world in 624 hours? Was there a group of humans, such as supergiants that are talked about in Genesis? So sometimes these things come up, but we know that Genesis seems to be recording real people. We know that Genesis 1-11 is an expanded linear genealogy, 10 generations from Adam to Noah. We know that the genealogies of Genesis chapter 5, 10, 11 are indicative of the historicity of people such as Adam and Cain and Enoch and Noah and Abram. We know the clause, this is the account, says these are the generations, or this is the history of. In these certain passages in Genesis is significant, and we know the New Testament assumes the historicity of Adam and Eve. We also know that Genesis includes the names and descriptions of geographical locations. Now, it comes to Genesis and science. There's always been different models out there how to reconcile science and scripture. One view is that science and scripture are completely independent of one another. They speak to two different domains. Another view is that science and scripture are in indirect conflict with one another. Another view is that science and scripture can complement one another. Another view is that science and scripture can be integrated. So if you deal with hardcore atheists or people like Richard Dawkins and other people that are popular level atheists, a lot of times they adhere to number 2 and they say that science and scripture are completely in conflict with one another. They never can be reconciled. And then, of course, the debate is over whether Genesis is strictly about theology or any science at all. Can Genesis just give us lessons to live by, and maybe we just can't say anything in Genesis is factually true? Stephen Jay Gould, who was a well-known paleontologist, came up with this thing called NOMA. It's called non-overlapping magisteria. And he believed that science and religion speak to two different areas. They don't even overlap at all. Two different domains, not necessarily in conflict, they just don't even intersect in any way. The problem with this is a lot of people to this day still assume that theology is about faith. It's subjective. There's no knowledge at all in theology. It's strictly subjective. You really don't know anything because it can't be objectively verified. And then we have science that supposedly gives us knowledge. It's testable. It's something we can rely on. And so we see this problem, this dichotomy that comes up here. And so this is an ongoing debate. It's been discussed in a lot of books, such as J.P. Moreland's latest work and also Nancy Pearcey's books. So we need to understand that when we're making theological claims, we're not saying we don't have any knowledge. It's just that some people think science is the only thing that can give us real knowledge. So that's an ongoing debate that's being discussed. Now, does Genesis teach creation out of nothing? That means that God literally created from nothing. That means there was absolutely nothing when God created the world. And so we know biblically the proclamation of God created, bara, the entirety of the heavens is stated 7 times in the Old Testament. And we know that the Hebrew verb translated created in Isaiah 42:5 has its primary definition of bringing into existence something new or something that did not exist before. And so when it comes to the beginning of the universe, we see this beginning point right here. Science didn't begin really till the beginning of the universe because the laws of nature had to have a starting point, and science can't do anything without the laws of nature. And we know science cannot explain the origin of the laws of nature, since the laws of nature are by definition descriptions of the way nature works. Such laws cannot exist as there is no nature for them to describe. So when we say that there was nothing, we need to clarify what we mean. Now, Hugh Ross has some definitions of what nothing means. Nothing can mean the complete absence of matter, energy, matter or matter and energy, or the absence of matter and energy in the 3 large cosmic space dimensions, length, width, and height. Or nothing can mean the complete absence of number 3 here, matter, energy, in all the cosmic space dimensions, including the 6 extremely tiny space dimensions implied by particle creation models. Or nothing can be the complete absence of matter and energy in all the cosmic space and time dimensions. Or nothing can mean the complete absence of matter and energy in cosmic space and time dimensions and created non-physical entities. Now, Hugh Ross also says, when we talk about the Big Bang, or we talk about, how it's related to cosmology, he says here in his book, The Creator and the Cosmos, the Big Bang is not a Big Bang as most lay people would comprehend this term. This expression conjures up images of bomb blasts and exploding dynamite. Such a bang would yield disorder and destruction. In truth, this bang represents an immensely powerful yet carefully planned and controlled release of matter, energy, space, and time with strict confines of carefully fine-tuned physical constants and laws that govern their interactions, their behavior and interactions. So it's important to understand what we mean when we say Big Bang. Of course, many Christians think the Big Bang is an atheist thing. And many atheists don't want Christians to even use the Big Bang at all to talk about God. So we need to make sure we understand what we're talking about. Now, can science really say anything about the cause of the beginning of the universe? Depends on how we define science. If you go by this definition right here, the answer would be no, because it says here in this definition from this online website, it says science is limited to explaining the natural world by means of natural processes. It cannot use supernatural causation in its explanation. Similarly, science is precluded from making statements about supernatural forces because they are outside its provenance. And so, if we're going to use that definition of science, then no, science would not be able to say anything about God involved with the creation of the universe, because science is only allowed to study natural causation. So it depends on how we define science when we're talking about this issue. Of course, intelligent design has tried to work in this area to say that the definition of science needs to be broadened out. That's an ongoing debate. And then when it comes to Genesis, we get into the issue of Adam and historical Adam. That's been an ongoing debate. There's a lot of books that have come out on this recently, so you can get some of these. This latest book came out over the last 3 or 4 months called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, The Surprising Science of Universal Ancestry. You can get that book as well. Now, I think that most people hold, at least Christians hold to this traditional view here, given a summary by Scott McKnight, that there were 2 actual and sometimes only 2 persons named Adam and Eve that existed suddenly as a result of God's creation. That these 2 persons have a biological relationship to all humans that are alive today, the biological Adam and Eve. And then we have, of course, their DNA is related to our DNA, and that often means that often means that these two sin died and brought death into the world. We know these two passed on their sin nature to all human beings. We don't necessarily know how that happened, how it's transmitted. The point is we have a sin nature as well. We know without their sinning and passing on that sin nature to all human beings, not all human beings would be in need of salvation. And we know, therefore, if one denies historical Adam, it's going to lead to problems with the gospel. We know the New Testament affirms a historical Adam and Eve in many passages. I'm not going to read them all. You can go look them up yourself. And there was actually an article online, which you can read here from a couple years back, that said all humans may be descended from just two people, and a catastrophic event almost wiped out all species 100,000 years ago. There is a book that came out over the last 3 or 4 years called Adam and the Genome. Kind of controversial book written by a geneticist and a New Testament scholar, Sot McKnight. Contributed a little bit there. And so this has been a book that's been debated, talking about whether this book really challenged the traditional reading of Adam in the scriptures, whether science itself, modern science and population genetic studies, had showed that the traditional view reading of how humans came from a pair such as Adam and Eve is wrong. And so there's been a lot of responses to this book. You can read some of them right here online. Just remember that this book has not really settled the case, but certainly there's been some debate about it, and there's more than enough articles to talk about it. Now, of course, what comes up a lot of times is there similarity in human chimp DNA evidence. Is that similarity in human chimp DNA evidence strong evidence for common descent? Because a lot of times you hear that humans and chimpanzees share over 90% of their DNA. Of course, more recent studies have shown the true genetic divergence between humans and apes is probably closer to 70%. Of course, humans and dogs share 80% of their DNA. Humans, dogs, and mice and apes are going to have DNA in common as well because we're all mammals. So in the end, this issue is debated. The 90% is not really true anymore. That's kind of an old statement, a little outdated. And it could provide more evidence for a common designer, because designers often make different products by utilization of similar parts, materials, and arrangements. But the point is that we share DNA with a lot of other things besides chimpanzees. So make sure someone doesn't just quote that and assume that it's just settled, that we evolved, or the common descent model is absolutely true and that's just settled. It's debated as well. And remember this issue about the issue of the Genome Project, that is the book of life. And that is the hardware software that programs us to be human. Mutations are like word processing errors in that program, and children get, of course, all their DNA from their two parents. And then you had Francis Collins, who was in charge of this project, and now he said he is one that kind of challenged the traditional reading of Adam and Eve. Now he, of course, is a Christian now, but he says it does not go back to a single couple, but rather to original breeding population, perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 individuals. One possibility is that Adam is the first spiritual hominoid, and that he is the one that was endowed with a soul. And so he acts as a representative, the head of humanity. And so you have this group of people, or these thousands of people, and Adam is the first one to become the first special representative, the first spiritual one, where God breathes a soul into him. And so that's a possibility, but that's being debated as well. There are challenges to some of these population genetic studies that are out there, the studies that are trying to show the traditional reading of Adam is wrong. You can read this online here. It's called Genetic Modeling of Human History, Part 1, Comparison of Common Descent and Unique Origin Appearances. And so you can read that right there. That's online. And then you have this book that came out called Searching for Adam. There is an excellent chapter in here called Genetics Confirms the Recent Supernatural Creation of Adam and Eve by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen and Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. But they have an excellent chapter in there about this issue of population genetics and whether it undermines a traditional reading of Adam. So you may want to get that. It's in that book right there. And just remember, one possibility is that God, perhaps could not God have designed a multitude of genetic variants in Adam and Eve right from the start? One wonders maybe about the ramifications of God's intervention in the Tower of Babel. Could genetic differentiation have been introduced at the same time as the confusion of languages? And this book is really interesting. This book by Eugene Harris called Ancestors in Our Genome, The New Science of Human Evolution. And he says here that we simply could not have evolved in the time scientists assign our split from chimps about 6 million years ago, because many coordinated changes are required to turn an ape into an animal. And this author, Harris, he acknowledges with complex features like skeletal traits, we can expect there to be many DNA challenges responsible for them, and we can expect that these DNA challenges will not have occurred only in a single gene, but in numerous different genes. And there's a couple mathematicians here, Duret and Schmidt, and they calculated to get a single mutation such a regulatory site would take 6 million years, as much time as we've got to evolve from apes to us. Even if every gene evolves simultaneously, all these mutations would need to work together to create special traits or helpful traits, since mutations are blind to benefit, mostly harmful, and typically work against each other. Simply is enough time for it to happen. And so there is an issue of time with this debate over evolution, whether there is enough time. And so you can get that book and read deeper on that if you want to, go deeper on that if you want to. So I hope this presentation helped you with some of the issues with Genesis that come up. I hope that it'll help you to go deeper. There's more than enough resources out there if you want to read further. And I just know some of these issues have come up in my conversations with others. Of course, some of these issues are debated in scholarship, but I hope that hopefully you can take from this what you want and use it in your discussions with others and work on it in your own discipleship. Have a good day.